California could, of course, once boast one of the greatest public higher education systems in the United States. That is until Ronald Reagan became governor of the state in 1966 after he vowed on his campaign was premised to, quote, clean up the mess at Berkeley. He promised during his first year in office that he would make sure that taxpayers in the state were no longer, quote, subsidizing intellectual curiosity. So you can see in Reagan's pledge the roots of what has become this ongoing effort in California, in the US, and elsewhere to defund public education, to defund higher education. And it's something that in the United States really enabled for-profit schools to step in to meet the demands of students. In the state of California, the waiting list for community colleges, which are local two-year colleges, the waiting list in the state is over 500,000 students. Because there's no room because there's no money. And you can see in Reagan's call as well to not fund intellectual curiosity a way in which higher education has been redefined. Thanks, California, right? Thanks, Reagan. It's now all about jobs. It's all about skills. So despite thinking of themselves, I think, as really liberal-leaning, today's tech companies actually reinscribe this. Everyone should learn to code, they say, right? Not everyone should have a liberal arts education. In fact, they specifically say you shouldn't have a liberal arts education. You should just learn computer science. Or higher education is a bubble, as Peter Thiel says. Or we'll just unbundle the university. We'll have like Uber for education is the latest one. Right? And my argument is that this is not something that just happens in California, right? This is a profoundly globalizing idea that appears elsewhere, and that it appears and lives sort of hard-coded into the technologies that we adopt, particularly the technologies that we adopt in education. It's this idea of the California ideology, which is an essay that was written in 1995 by Richard Barbook and Andy Cameron. But the California ideology tends to not make most of the top trends lists, right? They'd want you to look at the blockchain or VR or something else, right? But the ideology, this ideology permeates our digital technologies. And I argue that if we ignore it, we kind of misconstrue what's happening with the tools that are being built, right? We misconstrue what's going on. We overlook what's happening in venture capital. For example, 2015 was a record-setting year for investment in education technology. Some $4 billion flowed into the industry globally. The total fell really sharply in 2016, only $2.2 billion. The number of investments last year fell by 11%. It's a bit too early to tell what 2017 will bring. I think that Brexit and Trump have made markets kind of go, shit. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. But I repeatedly select the business of education technology as one of my top ed tech trends because I think it's really crucial to recognize how this gets funded, how these tools get funded, and the system in which they're created. Particularly the tools, not the tools that we built, that schools build in-house, but the ones that they purchase and the third-party vendors. And I want to think about what are the investors' interests in education and education technology. What sort of companies and what sort of products do venture capitalists like? I mean, other than the ones that are founded by like 21-year-old white guys, which is probably the most important thing. What's the appeal of funding education? Does it make you feel good? Is it profitable? No, right? Is there some imagined future, however, about privatization? Maybe. Right? Turns out investors really like testing companies. They like tutoring companies. They like learn to code companies. And in the US, they really, well, actually globally, they like private student loan companies. So that gives you a good sense of what investors are thinking the future of education is going to look like. Lots of testing, tutoring, which means affluent parents paying money for their children to perform better than others. Learn to code, skills-based education, and private student loans. This idea that perhaps the public investment in education will go away. You know, and then we can think about why has education fallen off in the last year or so. Again, turns out that free might not be the best business model for a for-profit company, particularly one that cannot rely on advertising quite the same way that Google or Facebook can. Turns out also that a lot of the education startups that have been promising revolution and improved outcomes for the past couple of years have been selling a lot of snake oil. Turns out that the typical timeline that venture capitalists work with, right, once they make an investment, you have about 3 to 5 years before they want their money back, plus more money, right? And that's not a lot of time for someone to get started and get going in education. Education works on a different kind of timeline, right? And not just because institutions are slow to change, but because you're dealing with a longer timeline of students moving through the system. So the 3 to 5 years doesn't really necessarily work. And then it turns out finally that Pearson, which once funded and acquired a lot of startups, isn't in particularly good financial shape. I know, it's very typically American, I recognize, to come to the UK to talk about education technology and to say, oh, it's really all about the US, it's all about our values, it's all about the state I live in even, and then to invoke Pearson, of course, a company that was founded in Yorkshire in 1844 and is the largest education company in the world, and still insists that somehow the Silicon Valley narrative and the California ideology are the dominant forces shaping education technology. I'm not thrilled with it either, mind you. But I think that Pearson actually fits quite neatly into some of the disruption talk that Silicon Valley perpetuates, right? And the notion of analytics, and the notion of testing, and the notion of deliverology, or whatever made-up word Michael Barber talked about, fit quite well with the way in which technology companies imagine education being content delivery models that can be streamed into your devices, and then we can sort of track your clicks and give you multiple choice questions. Pearson fits quite well with that model. In his book, Distrusting Education Technology, sociologist Neil Selwyn pointed out 3 contemporary ideologies that he said were intertwined with today's technologies. And I say, you know, I use the Silicon Valley narrative as a shorthand. He says they're libertarianism, neoliberalism, and the ideology of the new economy. And I would add another one to that list, and that's the notion of solutionism, technological solutionism that draws on the work of Yevgeny Morozov. And that is if students are struggling to graduate, or if they're not engaged, right, if they're not scoring well on the PISA test, that the solution is necessarily technological, right? We don't look at social systems, we don't look at other issues. We think, let's get more analytics, let's collect more data, let's build an app, let's surveil them a little bit more. There's got to be a technological solution. And Neil Selwyn says that education technology is ideologically freighted. And I think that that ideologically freightedness appears in all of the trends I have identified since 2010. I mean, I think you can see neoliberalism, for example, in this effort towards privatization, right? the outsourcing of core competencies, core technological competencies from universities to third-party vendors. Right? This is what the MOOCs were about. Right? Instead of building stuff in-house, you outsource it to a vendor, you privatize it. I don't think there's any better expression of sort of the Silicon Valley narrative right now in education technology, though, than personalization, which is this word used to describe both how Netflix tells you what movies to watch and how Amazon suggests, I guess, what books you want to read, but also what other household products they might think you need, how Google gives us search results. And in education, I guess, the next content model that you're supposed to click on. Personalization is, I think, really the sort of programmatic expression of individualism. It's very Silicon Valley, California notion of individualism. The individual, that's whose sovereignty matters most. That's whose freedom is sort of squelched by the collective. Personalization is this idea that the world can be and should be algorithmically crafted to best suit you individually. Right? Provided, of course, that your needs and desires coincide with the person who wrote the algorithm and the choices that are offered on the platform. But we still call it personalization, even though Netflix always suggests crappy movies, because the Netflix catalog is full of crappy movies. Somehow it's a personalized list of crappy movies that you can choose from. But you're not supposed to question it because you choose. So you're empowered. You're empowered to choose your crappy movie. So personalization in platforms, and again, these are not simply technological innovations, right? These are political, they're social, and they're shaping culture and politics and institutions and individuals in turn. So back in 2012, I chose the platforming of education as one of the top trends. And I made that selection that year partially because that was what the MOOCs seemed to want to become, right? Also, there was a startup in the US called Edmodo that sells a pseudo-learning management system to K-12 schools. And really, the learning management system is a bit of a prototype for how technologists think about platforms, right? Platforming was this goal that technology companies talked about. To be a platform means you're the next Facebook, you're the next Google. So you're going to make your investors and your founders very, very rich, but you're also going to centralize all the services, right? All the features, all the functionality, so that really people are encouraged to go nowhere else online, right? Platforms aspire to be monopolies of sorts. Purportedly, they enable data to move around through APIs, right? You can collect data, you can build things on the platform, right? But really, it's about centralizing the data. They're silos, right? They want all of our actions to occur there. Think Facebook, right? Or actually think, even think AOL. If you're old enough to remember AOL, what it would like warn you, like, oh, you're about to leave AOL. You don't want to go on the web, right? So they want to keep you inside. Actually, the learning management system is almost precisely the same. Keep you inside the silo where all your actions can be tracked and all your actions can be monetized. And I started to think last year, well, maybe the platforming of education didn't really happen. Maybe it was a failure, right? So Edmodo, the company I mentioned, they raised $87.5 million in venture capital, and they still haven't figured out a business model. Right? They're just churning through that money, hoping that magically they can stay afloat. So they haven't even figured out the business model. Let become a powerful platform that everyone uses and all school activities run through. Similarly, the MOOC thing didn't really work out as MOOCs. Almost all of those MOOC startups from 2012 have pivoted in some way or another towards corporate training. But even as corporate training, they really aren't a platform, right? Corporate entities are not running all of their corporate training through the Coursera interface. They haven't become corporate training platforms. I think that's what Microsoft aspires to be when it acquired the professional social network lynda.com, which of course had previously acquired, they acquired LinkedIn, and they had previously acquired lynda.com. I think Microsoft hopes to be the corporate training, corporate everything platform. You can't write any sort of document without getting suggestions of what classes you might take to make the document prettier, or who you might know in your LinkedIn profile that would help you make your document better. So platforms haven't gone away, even though in education, education technology companies have not really successfully platformed education yet. Technology companies, on the other hand, they actually seem pretty well poised to platform education. Not just Microsoft, of course, but Google and Apple. Even Facebook has made an effort to that end. In the US, they partnered with a chain of charter schools, the Summit Public Schools, in order to build a personalized learning platform. From the company's website, the platform comes with a comprehensive curriculum developed by teachers. The base curriculum is aligned with a common core. Each course includes meaningful projects, playlists with content and assessment, all of which can be customized. Teachers can adapt or create playlists to meet their student needs. Playlists, that's the new word. Listen for it this year when you hear people talking about personalization. Playlists. It's like Spotify, but for learning. Quote, students build content knowledge. Students build content. Thanks, Facebook. Students build content knowledge by working at their own pace and taking assessments on demand, their website says. So, but why students get to choose what they tackle that's on the playlist, like the playlist is set. It's just like Netflix, right? You get to choose which movie you want or which song you listen to from the circumscribed list of selection that your teacher has predetermined, or that Facebook has predetermined. Altschool is another one of these Silicon Valley companies that says it's working on a personalized learning platform. It was founded in 2014 by Max Ventilla, a Google executive who had no experience with education, but he took a picture of like 8 books he was reading and shared it on Instagram. So he did his research, right? Altschool has raised $133 million in venture funding from Mark Zuckerberg's venture fund, from the Emerson Collective, which is the venture philanthropy firm founded by Steve Jobs' widow. Founders Fund, that's Peter Thiel's venture capital fund. Andreessen Horowitz, of course, Mark Andreessen of Netscape fame, and Ben Horowitz, if you're familiar with campus politics in the US, the name David Horowitz might ring a bell. So a real great list of investors for thinking about shaping the future. Altschool is perhaps one of the most frightening things I hear about in education. It's a classroom, it's a private school that is of total surveillance. Cameras and microphones and sensors track the students and teachers, everything in the classroom. Their conversations, their body language, their facial expressions, their activities, the software that kids all get, computing devices. It tracks all the clicks. Everything is sort of viewed as a transaction that can be monitored and analyzed and then re-engineered if the system isn't running efficiently enough. Because that's exactly how small children should be educated. It should be re-engineered. Sterling University's Ben Williamson has written quite a bit about Altschool. He notes that they describe themselves as a, quote, full stack approach to education, and their blog says, as opposed to the traditional approach of selling or licensing technologies, the full stack builds an end-to-end product. Why take a full stack approach to education, he says, because you want to own the total outcome. The Altschool investor said, we are building the world's biggest private school system. We want to make that experience one that is affordable, better, and revolutionary, but you have to own every piece of the learning. It's not your learning, buddy. It's your company, maybe. But so, you know, while this company started as a private chain of schools, now it wants to just sell the software to schools. So instead of starting new schools, they're just going to sell everyone on this full stack approach. And that is platforming education, right? And that's really frightening because, you know, that's thinking about centralizing, controlling the software, the data, the analytics, and now this spills out not just from the software that schools buy, but into the material world, right? Where it's connected to sensors and cameras, and it shapes all the practices in the classroom. If your classroom, if every gesture and every sigh is being monitored and tracked, that absolutely shapes the practices that happens in the classroom. And I think it shapes our imagination of what a school looks like. And, you know, platforms to me are something to really pay attention to when we think about this particular political moment right now, right? Platforms are, in essence, capitalism distilled to its essence. Platforms are not a substitute for community. They're not a substitute for collective political action. We need to be resisting, I think, the platforming of education. We need to resist because of the repercussions to labor, the labor of teaching, and the labor of learning. I think we should resist the Silicon Valley narrative as it comes into our institutions because of the repercussions to those institutions, right? For the law and for democracy. Someone said the other day when a bunch of when the state of Washington tried to appeal Trump's travel ban, it was because the Attorney General of the state of Washington is the attorney for the public universities in the state. So he could make a legal case about the needs of the universities against this, the Muslim ban that Trump wanted to put in place. But if you unbundle the university, if you platform education, you don't have that same sort of appeal to law and democracy. And that's the moment that we're at right now. We're at this crisis moment, I think, already for a number of political reasons. But this is a moment where our collective political action and our public institutions are incredibly important. And so we need to be thinking as the education technology trends sort of get sold to us, what accompanies them, right? I want us to think not just about the products that we can use or even the predictions that people talk about the future, but I want all of us to think about sort of the ideological underpinning of these technologies and the implications, particularly in 2017, for democracy. Thank you. Sorry, that was longer than half an hour. Okay.